Last week we were talking about how foreign nations, especially European nations, but also Japan, were carving up China in the 19th century. And as more and more foreign nations gained concessions in China, a number of Chinese reformers clamored for changes that would enable China to modernize and to westernize. And this was seen by those reformers as consistent with Confucianism, with Confucian philosophy, that is, which always had stressed the need to be able to adapt and to reform. They felt, these reformers, that Chinese civilization and culture could be preserved, but with Western technology could just be sort of an adjunct, an addition to what China was already doing. Zhu Jiyu, who lived from 1795 to 1873, authored a work entitled A Short Account of the Maritime Circuit, and it was published in 1850. And it called for Zhijiang, or self-strengthening. Now actually, self-strengthening was an old Confucian term, which he resurrected to explain the need for China to help itself through modernization, through westernization. So, self-strengthening. A host of organizations called or having self-strengthening in their title arose throughout China to explore methods whereby China could enter the modern world. Another prominent scholar was Yang Fu, who proved especially instrumental in translating many Western books into Chinese. And these included things like Thomas Huxley's Evolution and Ethics, John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and Herbert Spencer's Study of Sociology. And yet another author we want to look at is Kang Youwei. He exercised a profound influence on the Emperor Guangxu. Because of Kang Youwei's ideas, Emperor Guangxu became convinced that he should embrace reform. After all, before him, in Russia, Peter the Great, as Emperor of Russia, had embraced reform. And the Meiji Emperor, he had embraced reform as well, the Meiji Emperor of Japan. According to Kang Youwei, Confucius saw history as this kind of universal progression, which would pass through 3 stages, and each of those stages would have an appropriate form of government. The first, according to Kang Youwei, that Confucius saw was an age of disorder, whereby there would be a rule by an absolute monarch. Then he thought, well, there'll be a second stage, the age of approaching peace, where there would be a constitutional monarch. So again, where a constitution would come into play and a monarch would have to abide by the restrictions, the regulations of that constitution. And then he thought, Kang Youwei, that there'd be a third age, the age of great peace, which would be rule by the people. So these ideas of self-strengthening were already in the works and were influencing Emperor Guangxu, who reigned from 1875 to 1908. Of course, he was 2 years old when he came to the throne, and died one day before Cixi, the Empress Dowager, who probably, had him poisoned. So convinced that there needed to be reform, Guangxu began what is called in Chinese history the 100 Days of Reform, and this occurred in 1898. Within 100 days' time, Emperor Guangxu issued some 110 imperial edicts, in actually 103 days, but close enough. And these imperial edicts called for vast changes in China. Now, at least nominally, Cixi, the Empress Dowager, of whom we've already spoken, in the prior week, at least she nominally supported his efforts, and she was, after all, the real power behind the throne. When, however, Guangxu sought the collaboration of the reformer Yuan Shikai in eliminating a person called Rong Lu, an important lieutenant and friend of Cixi, then Yuan Shikai exposed the plot. So again, the emperor, Guangxu, wanted to get rid of Rong Lu, who was a friend, confidant, and lieutenant of Cixi. Well, Yuan exposed the plot, and an enraged Cixi ordered the arrest and detention of the emperor Guangxu in September of 1898. Subsequently, she moved against the Chinese reformers, some of whom she had executed. Further, she issued new edicts reversing many of the reforms that the emperor had made in those 100 days. Well, the conservative anti-reformist backlash also included an anti-foreign element. Foreigners had long supported the cause of reform in China, and the British ministry now warned the Chinese that the Emperor Guangxu should not be harmed in any way. Added to that British warning were these intense anti-foreign feelings felt by many of the peasants in China. And it's not surprising that the situation quickly approached combustion. Missionaries were usually Europeans, so anti-foreign opinions among Chinese peasants sometimes appeared in anti-missionary kinds of activities. And indeed, in 1896, 1897, anti-missionary riots erupted in 6 Chinese provinces. You remember last week we talked about the year of leases, the year of concessions given to Europeans, 1898. And just as a review, we said that in 1898, Germany was granted railroad and other privileges in Shandong Peninsula, which is, on the mainland of China. And after this, the situation even worsened among the peasants and Chinese who felt that, the Europeans were becoming more and more of a problem in Chinese society. In 1899, a secret society in that Shandong Peninsula, known by foreigners as the Boxers, because they actually practiced Chinese boxing. The Boxers in Shandong began to terrorize the countryside. Now, at first, the Chinese government made efforts to quell the violence. But by June of 1900, the Empress Dowager Cixi actually seemed to support the violence because it was anti-foreign. Well, a number of countries, including Britain, the United States, Russia, Germany, France, Italy, Austria, and Japan, feared violence to their embassies in the capital in Beijing. So these powers sent 2,000 troops to protect their embassies in Beijing. Still, despite those 2,000 troops, the Boxers managed to overtake the embassies, the foreign embassies in Beijing, and proceeded in a general massacre, actually gaining control of the important city of Tianjin as well. Foreign warships responded quickly, and by August of 1900, foreign reinforcements numbering 20,000 troops entered Beijing. Now, the Empress Dowager Cixi fled Beijing, ostensibly on a quote-unquote tour of the West. And the former de facto minister, kind of prime minister, Li Hongzhang, he was drafted back into service. A protocol was signed by the European powers and China, which forced China to pay another indemnity. It was also to abandon certain fortifications between the cities of Dagu and Beijing, and it was to allow foreign troops to be stationed at their Beijing embassies. Now imagine this would be like, someone moving in with forces to protect their embassies in, say, the capital of Washington, D.C. I mean, this is obviously a major step that these European powers have taken in order to secure their foreign embassies. And it's a major incursion into Chinese sovereignty. And it also shows how badly that China was falling apart and not even able to put down its own rebellions. Well, one important point that comes out of the Boxer Rebellion is that it did provide Russia with an excuse to kind of occupy Manchuria. But before we look at that, we need to just review from the last time how Russia was moving into, remember, Siberia and into areas of Manchuria more and more and encroaching upon China. So we had talked about how the Chinese Eastern Railway, run by Russian companies, had crossed, was crossing Manchuria to Vladivostok, and that had received, obviously, the permission of China. We talked about how Russia had attained a 25-year lease of the Guangdong Peninsula, otherwise called the Liaodong Peninsula. And this is, I'm pointing to it on the map, that's the Liaodong Peninsula. Now, you're going to remember that that is going to really upset Japan over here, because Japan had won, remember, the Sino-Japanese War, and it was going to gain the Liaodong Peninsula, remember, but the European powers said they shouldn't take it, so Japan actually did not occupy the Liaodong Peninsula. And here, not many years later, just a few years later, in 1898, Russia moves in and gets a 25-year lease of the very Liaodong Peninsula that Japan wanted. Well, move ahead to the Boxer Rebellion, which we just did, which gave the Western powers an excuse to move troops into China, and Russia went ahead and sent troops into Manchuria at the time of the Boxer Rebellion. And why? Because they were interested in protecting their railroad interests. They sent even more troops. Russia sent even more troops over the railways into Manchuria in 1903, and Japan had had enough. It could not stand the fact that Russia was establishing a protectorate for all intents and purposes in Manchuria, which of course is just across the Sea of Japan from Japan. So a war broke out, the Russo-Japanese War. It was a short war, 1904 to 1905, and the winner was Japan. Now this actually kind of really changed things, because this is the first time you see, little Japan that, had just broken out of its days being overseen by samurai, and now it had an emperor, and it was modernizing right and left, and all of a sudden now Japan beat a Western power, Russia. It was an amazing thing. And Japan began to kind of see China as, well, China's falling apart, China's being carved up, so it's better that Japan starts to take over parts of Asia than it is to have the European powers move in and carve up Asia. So Japan is seeing it from its own viewpoint. It doesn't want to be carved up, so it's going to go ahead and try taking over bits and pieces of China and of Asia on its own, and seeing that, from its viewpoint, it would be better that that happens than to see the areas fall to European powers. The Treaty of Portsmouth ended the Russo-Japanese War, and it was partly negotiated by the U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt. And there Japan got the Liaodong Peninsula, which is, of course, what it always wanted. It also got the South Manchurian Railroad and the southern half of Sakhalin, which is an island up here, and you can see that. And again, that's shown, and it says 1905, right? Because that's the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905. Now, in 1910, Japan went on and just annexed Korea. And none of the Western powers protested, not even the United States. They just moved in and annexed Korea. In World War I, Japan would take over the German Shantung Peninsula and the German Pacific Islands, including the Marianas, the Carolines, and the Marshall Islands. And this is going to be a sore point for China as well, because when they do that again, they're moving in to Chinese territory. Well, obviously, the Qing dynasty was falling apart. China was falling apart. It was being carved up in concessions, in leases to the European powers. There were wars being fought. Japan was moving in addition to the European powers. The Boxer Rebellion, had occurred. There are people who are dissatisfied, and then there are revolutionaries and reformers that move in. And I'll let you read over my article from the World History Encyclopedia on Sun Yat-sen. Most studies still call him in the West Sun Yat-sen. In Pinyin, his name is actually Sun Zhongshang, but very few people actually refer to him in the West as that. They call him Sun Yat-sen. And you can learn all about his background in that article. He was one of the great revolutionaries of China and head of the Revolutionary Alliance, which was actually founded in Tokyo in 1905. And he had three principles of the people that he was striving for China: nationalism, democracy, and the people's livelihoods. By nationalism, he first meant anti-Manchu, anti-Qing dynasty things, that they really were not Chinese. By democracy, he certainly meant the establishment of a republic. And by livelihood, he was influenced by Henry George, who was a reformer in the West, who talked about in America the single tax theory, that the only really fair tax would be a tax on the unearned increment in land values. In other words, if you bought a piece of land for $100 and it then became worth $1,000, there would be a tax on that unearned increment. So he was very interested in some economic changes as well. Here is a photograph of Sun Yat-sen from a marvelous biography by Martin Wilbur called Sun Yat-sen, Frustrated Patriot, put out by Cambridge University Press. And then I want to kind of, contrast that. Okay, so you see that with this, which was the Qing court of the time. And this is actually, these photographs are taken from the autobiography of Puyi. This is little Puyi at, 2 years of age, when in Western years he came to the throne of China. And this is the Cixi, the Empress Dowager, right over there. So it's just kind of a good contrast with the reformers. So, Cixi, the Empress Dowager, who was the power behind the throne, in the interest of preserving the Qing dynasty and of China itself, it was obvious to her that she had no choice but to enact some reforms. She established new schools. and allowed Chinese nationals to study abroad. In 1905 and 1906, she actually sent Chinese officials abroad to study various governmental reforms. And by 1908, she announced a 9-year plan to inaugurate a kind of a quasi-constitutional government. In 1909, the first provincial assemblies were to be founded. Well, meanwhile, on November 15th, 1908, the Empress Dowager Cixi died, and she named as her successor the 2-year-old, now he would have been 2 years old in Western-style years, like we regard people, or 3 years old in the Chinese style of counting, which would be, you spend 9 months in the womb, so that adds another year to your age. But anyhow, so for Western, through Western eyes, he was 2 years old. The son of Prince Chun, who was the half-brother of Emperor Guangxu. Now, we already said that Emperor Guangxu died 1 day earlier than Cixi, so she probably had him poisoned just to make certain he wasn't around when she died and that this child emperor would take over. Now, the child emperor was officially called Xuantong, but much later he took the name Puyi. So we're going to refer to him as Puyi, and he's the little boy that you saw in the photograph just a few minutes ago. Well, obviously, a 2-year-old boy cannot do a whole lot. There are people governing on his behalf. And in 1911, the government nationalized the railroads. That is, they literally took over the railroads. They secured foreign loans to do this, to finance the nationalization of the railroads. And some people, especially the gentry, the more upper class, were just so upset, indeed indignant, over the increasingly dominant role of the foreign powers, as expressed especially in these foreign loans to finance the nationalization. They were dissatisfied with the railroad nationalization and the settlement that had been decided there, so they staged a revolution which erupted in Wuchang on October 10th, 1911. Thereafter, other additional provinces joined the revolt, and on February 12th, 1912, the child emperor Xuantong, or we'll call him, as we said, Puyi, was forced to abdicate the throne. China was declared a republic, and Sun Yat-sen, the reformer of which we've spoken, and of which you have the article, became president of the new Chinese Republic. Now, he didn't remain president for very long because he really lacked the necessary military support. He stepped down from the post of president in favor of another reformer, Yuan Shikai. And Yuan Shikai was actually kind of proved somewhat of a, well, not somewhat, he was a disappointment. He gradually assumed more dictatorial powers and for all intents and purposes was a dictator. Indeed, by 1913, he ordered the assassination of the leader of the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party. And here we're introducing the Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang. Then Yuan Shikai led a campaign against provincial governors who had Kuomintang sentiments. In what has been called the Second Revolution, the Nationalist Party resisted his efforts, but they were defeated. Sun Yat-sen and others fled to safety in Japan. Now, meanwhile, the beginning of the World War I, things deteriorated even more in China. During the First World War, Japan presented China with something that has become since really notorious, and it shocked the European powers. Japan made 21 demands of China. Now, we're not going to look at all 21 demands, but we're going to divide them, as at least one scholar, Shirakawa, does, I think, in 5 very reasonable subcategories or groups. One was that they wanted recognition of Japanese rights in the Shandong Peninsula, which the Japanese had seized during the war from World War I from the Germans. They wanted Japanese rights to be extended in Mongolia and Manchuria. They wanted a joint operation of the largest iron and steel company in China. They wanted China not to agree not to give any more coastal areas to any other power than Japan. And the 5th provision, which just was, and would have been a complete invasion of the sovereign powers of a sovereign nation, would have provided that the Chinese use Japanese advisors for all kinds of important official posts, military, political, economic, would have required China to buy Japanese weapons, and that the Japanese would have gained a partial control over the police in China. Now, Yuan Shikai didn't have much choice other than really to accede to the first 4, but he certainly did not agree to the 5th of these. Meanwhile, Yuan made plans to proclaim himself emperor, and he wanted to proclaim himself emperor as of January 1st of 1916. The outcry against his plan to become emperor proved so strong that Yuan relinquished his imperial ambitions in March of 1916, and he died shortly thereafter in June of 1916. Well, China really broke apart into what we call the warlord era, and we're going to talk about some things that happened right after really World War I. After Yuan Shikai's death, China, for all intents and purposes, was controlled by regional warlords, and these warlords literally had their own armies. Meanwhile, professors and students at Beijing University were talking about ways to reform China. So the air is filled with reforming ideas, but it's also filled with instability and warlordism. The situation became really acute when World War I ended, and the results of the Treaty of Versailles ending World War I became known to the Chinese. Now, the Chinese, you have to remember, during World War I, were on the sides of the Allies, but they really didn't have any voice whatsoever at the Treaty of Versailles. Indeed, the Allies granted Japan Germany's former possessions in the Shandong Peninsula. And this is like the 3rd time in this lecture that we keep coming back to that Shandong Peninsula. Germany lost the possessions there in World War I, and who gets them by Treaty of Versailles is Japan. Well, the Chinese are so upset, especially these reforming Chinese students. And as so often happens in world revolutions, but, certainly in China, the students demonstrated on May 4th of 1919, and violence erupted, followed by general strikes throughout China. The level of dissatisfaction with the Chinese government grew, numerous arrests were made, and in the end, the government was forced to release those who had been arrested, and a number of government officials were forced to resign. This whole thing then was called the May 4th movement, but it really sort of came to be identified with the whole period, from really 1915 during the war all the way to the early 1920s. A flood of publications attacked everything in China, from the traditional culture to a total rejection of the past, including such basic things as the family. They talked about a host of new and radical ideas, Some people, were just, especially young people, were going right against the conventions of arranged marriage. There was organizing of labor unions and all kinds of social action. And so it was really kind of an amazing time period, but one that was also very unstable. Now, if you add to that the fact that the Bolsheviks had been successful in 1917 in staging a communist revolution in Russia, then you get another political alternative or possibility for China. So in 1921, the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, was founded. And in 1923, Sun Yat-sen, who, by the way, had returned to China after the death of Yuan Shikai, and of course, Sun Yat-sen was of the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party. He agreed to cooperate with the Chinese Communist Party, and that was something that was achieved until 1927. Sun Yat-sen died in March 1925, and Chiang Kai-shek emerged as the new leader of the Kuomintang. In 1927, he ended the official cooperation of the Kuomintang, that is, of the Nationalist Party, with the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and he ordered a bloody purge of the communists. He established the headquarters of his own government in Nanjing. And in June of 1928, after a scant 2 months of fighting, Beijing fell to the Kuomintang, to the nationalists. For all intents and purposes, China was being reunited, but there were still warlords around, so the unification was far from complete. In fact, warlordism really remained a problem until 1949. Well, now, as all of that is happening, in 1931, Japan seized Manchuria from China. And in the following year of 1932, Japan set up in Manchuria the puppet state of Manchukuo. And they put as head of that puppet state Puyi, the former child emperor of China, as ruler of the new Japanese state of Manchukuo. Well, it was just all window dressing. Manchukuo was nothing other than a colony of Japan. And the fact that they put Puyi up as emperor because he was, remember, from the Qing dynasty, which was Manchurian, and so somehow they convinced him that he would rebuild this Manchurian empire based in Manchukuo, was just a charade, because Puyi was nothing but a puppet in the hands, a puppet emperor in the hands of the Japanese. The League of Nations condemned this takeover, this Japanese takeover of Manchuria, but it was to no avail, because if you remember, the United States never joined the League of Nations, and the League of Nations never really had any teeth. In spring of 1933, the Japanese crossed the Great Wall and concluded a truce with China, leaving the Japanese in control of the area north of the Great Wall. Of course, internally, China was racked by division and dissension. Chiang Kai-shek's regime even adopted a fascist kind of element with a secret police group called the Blue Shirts. And the Blue Shirts, again, were the secret police group that was pledged to complete obedience to Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek also began a campaign against the Chinese Communist Party, and that really reached its height in 1934 with the Long March of the Communists. The Chinese Communist Party, under the leader Mao Zedong and the other leader Zhu De, had based communist activities in the province of Jiangxi. And in Jiangxi, the communists, with Mao Zedong, were doing a very good job of making the peasants their friends, because they were actually redistributing land from wealthier people to the peasants. Well, in 1933, Chiang Kai-shek of the Kuomintang, the nationalists, sent 750,000 troops and 150 airplanes to surround the Chinese Communist Party in Jiangxi. The communists, though, succeeded in breaking through the lines of the Nationalist Party of Chiang Kai-shek, the Kuomintang, and they began their so-called Long March, covering about 6,000 miles, and they went all the way to the province of Shanxi, home of the ancient capital city of Xi'an, in about 1 year's time. Now, the communists, about 100,000 of them set out originally from Jiangxi. Less than 10% of them actually completed the march. Some were left behind to work in various areas. Some perished along the way. Of course, they got new recruits all along the way again. By the time they reached Shanxi, the communists were about 20,000 people strong. Determined to continue his campaign against the communists, Chiang Kai-shek personally flew to Shanxi and to the city there of Xi'an. There he was captured and detained for 2 weeks before being released. The Xi'an incident convinced Chiang Kai-shek to agree to a united front between the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang, a united front between those two parties against the Japanese in 1937. After all, in summer of 1937, war erupted anew between China and Japan. By the end of July 1937, the Japanese had taken the cities of Beijing and Tianjin, and by August they attacked Shanghai. A 3-month siege of that city resulted. In December, Nanjing, the city of Nanjing, fell, followed by the notorious rape of Nanjing. Japanese soldiers went on a rampage throughout the city of Nanjing, killing and raping, burning and looting. When after 7 weeks it was all over, at least 42,000 people were dead in Nanjing. The Japanese acquired from the rape of Nanjing a reputation for terrible cruelty, which of course just made the Chinese all the more determined to resist. In 1938, the Japanese continued to sweep across China, taking even Guangzhou, or that is Canton. In 1941, after the Japanese attacked on Pearl Harbor and America's entry into the war, of course, the situation improved somewhat, although it would take some time for America to win the war in the Pacific, because the United States was really concentrated first on the war in Europe. Now, after World War II, dissatisfaction with the Kuomintang, with the Nationalist Party, increased in China. And the reasons for that are very well covered in your book by Gelber, The Dragon and the Foreign Devils. The Kuomintang was intensely corrupt. And in the meantime, while it became less and less popular, the Chinese Communist Party increased in popularity. At the end of the Second World War, Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang remained in control of post-war China, and they were recognized by all of the Allies, including the Soviet Union and the United States, as the official legal government of China. Nevertheless, the Kuomintang was not popular, and it controlled the cities, whereas the countryside, the rural areas, were largely under the influence of the Chinese Communist Party. So these two parties were fighting themselves, the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang. One military victory after another led the Chinese Communist Party soon to gain the upper hand. And October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong of the Chinese Communist Party proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China. And this is when, in 1949, the communist era for China began. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist followers fled to Taiwan, where they claimed to be the government of China in exile. And of course, it was Taiwan which the United States recognized as the Chinese government in exile. The United States, for a long time, until the time of Richard Nixon, President Richard Nixon, did not recognize the People's Republic of China in any way. Well, by the end of World War II and throughout the 1940s and the 1950s, the Cold War really was heating up between the United States, on the one hand, and so the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, what we now know as Russia, which of course had become communist. And in many parts of the world, conflicts that were part of the Cold War were taking place, Vietnam, other places, but one that really we need to talk about is the Korean War. During World War II, the United States and the USSR had agreed upon the 38th parallel as a dividing line. That is, Japanese troops north of the 38th parallel would surrender to the Soviet Union, and south of the 38th parallel, Japanese troops would surrender to the United States. Now, after the surrender, in the end of World War II, Korea was to be reunited and to have free elections. That never happened. In June of 1950, North Korea attacked South Korea. North Korea was communist, South Korea was a republic. Obviously, the United States, the United Nations became involved, and in September of 1950, U.S. General Douglas MacArthur landed in Korea and swept northward with his troops, his UN troops, advancing towards the Yalu River. Now, the Yalu River was very important because it was the border between North Korea and China. Well, China in response sent massive armies into Korea. The Chinese troops regained the north, a stalemate ensued, and in 1951 they began truce talks, and in 1953 an armistice was signed, whereby the 38th parallel was the dividing line and still remains the dividing line between North Korea and South Korea. The Korean War, America's refusal to recognize the People's Republic of China, the U.S.'s continuing support of that time during the Cold War of Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Taiwan, all contributed to an increase in Cold War feelings. And China, meanwhile, sought closer ties with the Soviet Union. That's all for this week. Any questions, feel free to email or phone me. I'm always happy to help. Have a good week.